In some previous videos, I've spoken about the Dutch and Australia, how they discovered Australia, never set up any colonies, and simply abandoned it to later be colonised by the British. But in this video, I'd like to look at a neighbouring place to Australia, and that is of course New Zealand, which in 1642 was also discovered for the first time by Europeans by the Dutch. Of course, New Zealand itself contains within it the name Zeeland, which is named after the Dutch province of Zeeland, because the Dutch decided that the huge mountains and spectacular coastline reminded them a lot of Vlissingen. Yes, that's Dutch people for you. But just as with Australia, the Dutch never decided to come back to New Zealand. They simply named it and then left. Or did they? Part of what makes the Dutch encounter in New Zealand so interesting is that it was particularly violent. As Abel Tasman, the captain of the VOC ships, was sailing into the bay that separates the North and South Islands, they were set upon by the local inhabitants in several war canoes. The Dutch fired their cannon as a warning shot, but they kept coming anyway. Several men on both sides were killed, and the Dutch sailed away. Abel Tasman would name the area Moordenaars Bay, that is, Murderers Bay, and they never returned. We now know that those native inhabitants that attacked the Dutch sailors were Māori. These were the descendants of the Polynesians who several centuries earlier had arrived in New Zealand as the first people to discover that landmass. The Polynesians had been abroad for millennia in the Pacific, sailing from island chain to island chain, and thus are some of the greatest navigators in history. We also know that the particular Māori iwi, or tribe, that encountered the Dutch were the Ngāti Tūmatakokiri. These were the people that lived on the northern part of the South Island. And while the attack may have seemed to come completely out of the blue, it certainly did for Abel Tasman and his men. Because we understand a bit more about Māori culture and practices at the time, it may have been the case that they were following a particular practice, a custom called rahui. This is essentially a temporary ritual prohibition. This could either be for a religious reason or indeed to preserve certain resources that were off limits to other people to gather. Rahui were particularly important for the Māori, and these also had a certain sacral dimension to them. The priest then proceeded by means of an incantation to sharpen the teeth of the rahui that it might destroy man. A kind of conditional curse was set upon the post, so that any person meddling with it, the forest, or the productivity thereof, either by practical or magical means, would be slain by the force of the spells associated with the rahui. So if someone were to go and to break a rahui, so this prohibitions put on a particular area, they would be killed either by magical or by other means. This is from Economics of the New Zealand Māori by Raymond Firth. It's therefore thought that the Dutch were sailing into an area where the local Māori iwi were growing kumara, that is sweet potato, a main staple of the Māori diet, and that this area had been put under rahui. Unbeknownst to the Dutch, they were sailing into an area that was off limits, and the Māori were duty bound to kill anyone that entered this area, hence the violent response. Now, of course, the Dutch were technologically far superior to the Māori, with firearms and cannons and huge vessels as opposed to waka or war canoes. So if they wanted to, they surely could have just sent a fleet from the East Indies and absolutely blown them to smithereens. Well, that's sort of looking at it the wrong way, because even though the Māori were a particularly ferocious people that gave the British a hard job when they arrived in New Zealand several centuries later, it wasn't the Dutch government that was out and building colonies in areas and wanting to take over bits of land and to fight other people. It was instead the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. They weren't interested in colonization for colonization's sake. They wanted a profit. They wanted to make money that could make them rich. And that really drives the Dutch expansion in Asia, and indeed explains why the Dutch didn't set up colonies in New Zealand or in Australia. They were much more focused on the Dutch East Indies, or what would become the Dutch East Indies. At this point, still just a few trading settlements in places, rather than controlling large areas of land, which really only started in the 19th century. They were interested in this area because of spices, because it could make them insanely rich in Europe where these prices were skyrocketing. Therefore, we really have to understand Dutch expansion, or the lack of expansion in certain areas in the Pacific, within this profit-oriented view. That's also why they didn't go with setting up a colony in southern Australia. Another important factor to bear in mind is population. In 1600, the Dutch Republic had a population of around 1.5 million. At least that's what's estimated. If we compare that to the British in both Britain and in Ireland, there were around 6 million. Certainly by 1800, this difference had really developed, so that where there were 1.9 million people living in the Batavian Republic at that point in the Netherlands, there were 15 million people living in Britain and Ireland. So simply the Dutch didn't have enough people to go and settle large colonial areas like the British did in America or later in Australia. The VOC itself was very international. While of course it was headed by Dutchmen, there were many different nationalities that would serve under the VOC, and this was part of its model because it simply didn't have enough people. Many of the first Dutch quote-unquote settlers in America, in what would become New York, in New Amsterdam, weren't Dutch at all. Many were Walloons, Danes, Swedes, and various peoples who spoke German, to name just a few, Portuguese, Jews, etc. So this is part of the reason why, for the Dutch, colonizing Australia and New Zealand was simply too much to ask. But perhaps the Dutch did return to New Zealand after abrupt Tasman. Interestingly, Cook himself documented accounts by local Maori of earlier encounters with Europeans, with the ships having been wrecked and the survivors killed and eaten. In AD 1770, and again in AD 1773, Captain Cook dismissed suggestions that he had been preceded by a foreign ship, but in AD 1777, he changed his earlier opinion and concluded that a foreign vessel had been wrecked before his first visit in AD 1769. This is from The Discovery of New Zealand's Oldest Shipwreck, a possible evidence of further Dutch exploration of the South Pacific by Jonathan Palmer et al. This is an article that was released in Science in 2014, and it's based on dendrochronological analysis done on 2 pieces of timber. This is essentially tree ring analysis to see how old a certain piece of wood is when it was cut down as a tree. Now, the 2 pieces of timber in question come from an area in the Northland part of the Northern Island of New Zealand, north of the capital Auckland, called Kaipara. This area they believe to have found a shipwreck in 1982. However, archaeologists didn't get permission to investigate the shipwreck. Whoa, conspiracy time. And so we don't actually know what the real context of this is, what kind of ship it was, whether it had been beached there, or even if it's a real shipwreck, essentially. However, they were able to salvage 2 pieces of timber, and then this is what the tree ring analysis has been done on today. So a lot about the context and the background of where this wood comes from is uncertain. We don't know what part of the ship it's from, for example, or whether the ship had been shipwrecked there or whether it drifted in. These are all things you can do if you actually know the location, but we don't know the location because they didn't get permission to search the site, and following this, it was then covered by sand. So that makes things a little bit more difficult. Here's a nice photo of some Kiwis looking at some timber that they found in the surf, and then these pieces of wood have been analysed. The kind of dating that they did was called carbon-14 dating, and from all accounts, I think that the methodology was pretty sound in the dating. They narrowed it down between the trees being cut between, let's say, 1621 and 1672, but then later they made a more accurate dating and believed that the ship was from around 1705. Now this is a crucial year, because around this time, these seas, it was really just the Dutch who were in large numbers sailing from place to place. Of course, going to the Dutch East Indies, returning. Many of those ships that ended up in Australia, like the video that I made about the Batavia, were actually on their way to, well, Batavia, which is now Jakarta, in Indonesia. and then they were blown off course. Abel Tasman was a little bit different. He was on an actual explorative mission when he discovered Australia for the Dutch. So that's slightly different, but it's thought then by the writers of this article that this was probably a Dutch ship. This is further strengthened by the fact that the kind of wood that these planks are made of is teak, and teak is a tropical hardwood found in most of the places where the Dutch were trading in the Indies, of course, in China and other places like this, which they were frequenting India, and so likely it comes from a Dutch ship. Another fact that points in this direction, they argue, is that there was copper sheathing on the bottom. They think that this comes from the hull, so the bottom of the ship. And the reason they would put copper sheathing there is that one of the biggest killers of ships in the Indies at this time, you can read lots of Portuguese accounts about this, Spanish accounts, Dutch, everyone suffered from it, is shipworm. They would essentially eat the bottom of the ship, and of course if you have a worm eating wood at the bottom of a ship, you're going to need a bigger boat and a newer boat because you're sinking. So to stop this, they would put copper sheathing on the bottom, which would stop shipworm getting in and destroying ships. They say, it is not possible to determine the length of time that elapsed between the construction and wreck of the vessel reported here, but given the above issues regarding the lifespan of tropical wood in the low to mid latitudes, it seems unlikely to have been more than 50 years. Given the ages obtained by the comprehensive radiocarbon dating reported here, we suggest the wreck is most probably of Dutch origin and may be one of the vessels reported by Maori to Cook on his arrival in New Zealand. If correct, this would imply there was continued Dutch interest in New Zealand after its discovery by Abel Tasman in AD 1642. These results therefore suggest the wreck at Midge Bay is the oldest known shipwreck in New Zealand. Whoa, exciting stuff. So did the Dutch come back to New Zealand after Abel Tasman? Perhaps looking to set up a colony, and was this its fate? Not everyone was convinced. The company was a bureaucratic organization, and the archives both of the directors in the Netherlands and its officials in Asia have been very well preserved. The history of the VOC has been extensively studied by generations of scholars. Given the general company policy towards exploration and the preservation of the company's records, it is improbable that a further expedition of the Dutch East India Company toward New Zealand could have escaped the attention of all contemporaries and later scholars. It is therefore unlikely that the vessel found in Midge Bay belonged to the VOC. This is from a response to the discovery of New Zealand's oldest shipwreck by Diederik Wildeman. There's also many issues with the initial article that was quoted. Of course, as I already alluded to in the little introduction to it, this was a wreck from 1982 that wasn't properly investigated. There were 2 pieces of timber that were salvaged or discovered, and then in 2014 they did dating on this. But as I said, this archaeologically is very difficult because we don't know how accurately these pieces of wood are from this supposed shipwreck, or what the actual story is behind the rest of the ship. If you have the full picture, you're in a much better position to be making conclusions. And it seems that the conclusions that were drawn about the shipwreck are almost entirely wrong. Part of the issue is with the conclusion that teak points towards the Dutch, that the Dutch in the East Indies had access to teak and that they were building ships there. The thing is, they weren't. The Dutch only built ships in the Netherlands because they only wanted to pay Dutch workers and to keep the industry in the Netherlands. The windmills, of course, meant that you had a lot of power, so you could attach saws and you could cut a lot of wood. That's one of the reasons why the Dutch were able to build these huge fleets that at the time were sailing around the seas. The Dutch never built ships in the Indies at all, even though at several points this was proposed. Their Portuguese and Spanish contemporaries, on the other hand, built ships in their colonies, including in South and Southeast Asia and the Americas. Finding tropical hardwood in the construction of an early 18th century ship is therefore a good indication that the ship is anything but Dutch. This is from another response to the discovery of New Zealand's oldest shipwreck by Wendy van Duivenvoorde. So it doesn't seem likely that this ship then is Dutch based on this fact. There's also another issue, that the conclusion drawn of the fact that there was copper sheathing on the bottom also is erroneous. This wasn't something that the Dutch were doing at this point. We only get real solid evidence that the Dutch were adding copper sheathing much later in the 18th century. This is something that the British started to do into the 19th century as well, that they became famous for, but the evidence simply isn't there that the Dutch were early pioneers of this method. And as already said, the dating, the provenancing of where this vessel comes from is really difficult. So we can't actually point to it being the oldest shipwreck in New Zealand before we do proper investigation and looking into the site. I'm not sure what the status is of the site and whether they are able to go and dig there, whether they actually know the current location of the site, with of course the shifting sands in this estuarine seascape. But in the future, hopefully they do get permission to go and look it up and to discover more about it, because whatever it is, even though it seems very unlikely that it's a Dutch ship, it's still cool, and it would still be interesting to find out what it actually was, where it came from, what the dating is, and perhaps there will be some more surprises in store. Most likely, I think it's probably a whaling ship or a sealing ship. These were in the late 18th century after Cook came to New Zealand. Whalers operating out of Australia a lot of the time sailed over to New Zealand to hunt whales. There were also people hunting seals at this point, and these are some of the earliest Europeans that would stay in New Zealand temporarily and later permanently, and then that's where you get the eventually the British claiming it as a colony. So my guess would be it's one of these ships from the later 18th century, but I have no way of supporting that conclusion. Let me know in the comments below. Did you enjoy this video? Did you know that there have been arguments that the Dutch perhaps came back to New Zealand? Or do you think that in an alternative timeline the Dutch might have actually decided to go and give it a go? I'm not sure how that would have gone, to be honest. The Maori certainly gave the British a good run for their money. On the subject of which, if you're interested in finding more about that, then I'd be happy to make some videos on that subject as well. So yeah, I find this quite interesting to look at, because it is kind of the thing where today you get a lot of people asking, well, they discovered it and then they abandoned it. How could they do it? But I think for the Dutch, as I said in the video, the VOC, really the mentality was all about profit, was all about making money, trading in spices. I guess that's also a meme, that the Dutch and the British got most of the spices in the world but never used it to improve their own cooking, because, well, you never get high on your own supply, hey? But anyway, thanks very much for watching, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ra.